Welcome to the debate. Today we're analyzing what is probably one of the strangest clauses in the U.S. Constitution, the 27th Amendment. The text itself is brief, seems simple enough. No law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened.
Right, and that provision, which, is meant to stop a sitting Congress from giving itself an immediate pay raise, it has the most extraordinary backstory of any amendment. It was originally proposed by James Madison way back in 1789, sent out with the Bill of Rights, and then, well, it was basically forgotten for 200 years.
It really was. After just languishing for 202 years, it was resurrected and finally ratified in 1992. And this was largely thanks to a campaign started by a college student. So this incredible historical gap, it forces a critical constitutional question. The central question for us today is whether this staggering 2-century ratification period is a legitimate exercise of the amendment power under Article 5, or if that delay itself just fundamentally undermined the whole process.
And I'm going to argue that the sheer passage of time fundamentally invalidates the process. I believe constitutional architecture requires a timely, a contemporaneous national consensus.
And I'll be arguing that the amendment's legitimacy is, well, unimpeachable, simply because it met the literal, explicit requirements laid out right there in Article 5, regardless of the timeline. So my position, it really all comes down to textual adherence. Article 5 sets 2 requirements for constitutional change: proposal by 2/3 of Congress, which happened in 1789, and then ratification by 3/4 of the states, which was finally achieved in 1992. Now, critically, when the first Congress proposed this amendment, it attached no time limit for ratification. The constitutional clock, in that sense, just never ran out. When the 38th state ratified it in 1992, the Archivist of the United States certified it, fulfilling the exact legal requirements. And on top of that, any argument about a lack of consensus was largely settled when Congress itself, the body most affected by this, passed near unanimous resolutions affirming the amendment. A vote of 414 to 3 in the House and a unanimous vote in the Senate. That shows a powerful contemporary political validation. It satisfies both the legal text and, I would argue, the spirit of national agreement.
See, that textual argument is very neat. I'll grant you that. But it completely ignores the fundamental structural principles of Article 5. A constitutional amendment isn't just a bureaucratic checklist, It's meant to capture a sort of magic moment of supermajority national consensus, the current political will of the people. And a 202-year gap, that just obliterates any possibility of a cohesive political moment. The process we're talking about relied on representatives ratifying a proposal centuries after it was made. And this is exactly what the Supreme Court cautioned against in Dillon v. Gloss back in 1921. Now, you're right to say it was in dictum, so these comments weren't the binding holding of the case. But the court observed that amendments proposed long ago and ratified by generations now largely forgotten are, and I quote, quite untenable. Well, the 27th Amendment is the ultimate test case for that very idea, and I think it creates a dangerous structural weakness in Article 5.
The structural vulnerability you mentioned, though, it only exists if we start inferring restrictions where the text itself provides none. If we let the judiciary or, later generations impose some kind of implied reasonable time limit, we're basically undermining Congress's explicit authority under Article 5 to either set a deadline or remain silent. And in this case, they chose silence. If the framers wanted immediate action, they certainly knew how to write that requirement.
But the structure itself demands timeliness. You have to look at who the ratifying bodies were. When Madison proposed this, the nation had, 14 states? So ratification required 11 votes. These were small, recently revolutionary states, politically, culturally, much more homogeneous than today. When the certification finally happened in 1992, it required 38 out of 50 states, a vast, disparate, modern country. The very idea that an 11-state consensus from 1789, which was driven by early post-revolutionary concerns, can just be merged with a 38-state consensus from 1992 driven by public anger over congressional pay hikes, well, it's just intellectually dishonest. The political nature of the original act is totally lost. That final burst of activity was, as many scholars argue, less a cohesive act of constitutional design and more of an opportunistic political reaction.
I appreciate the argument about the changing character of the republic, but the fact is that the required supermajority was achieved in 1992. It wasn't just 11 states, it was 38, the highest possible threshold acting on current political priorities. That final wave of ratifications, I think it was over 30 states in less than a decade, that proves a truly contemporary consensus existed. It wasn't just resting on these historical one-offs like Ohio in 1873. The movement was sparked by Gregory Watson's paper and this widespread public anger over congressional pay. That speaks directly to the amendment's core purpose, accountability. The widespread, vigorous agreement among modern state legislatures in the early 1990s demonstrates that the political will was immediate and overwhelming at the time of certification. That fulfills the spirit of contemporaneous consent, even if the starting pistol was fired 2 centuries earlier.
But if that process is valid, you open the door to some extreme precedents. I mean, I worry about the resurrection of truly dead constitutional proposals. Take the Corwin Amendment, proposed in 1861, which was designed to protect slavery forever. It's still out there, with 4 state ratifications. If that could be revived today by the remaining states without any new congressional consent, we are effectively being governed by the ghosts of dead political priorities.
That's a compelling point about the Corwin Amendment, but I would frame it differently. I think the difference lies in the nature of the policy, and importantly, the subsequent actions of Congress. The 27th Amendment deals with an ongoing institutional issue of self-governance, which is why it retains validity. Furthermore, the fact that the 27th was then affirmed by those near-unanimous congressional resolutions, that serves as a kind of protective barrier against truly toxic resurrections. That's a political consensus that would, I think we can agree, be completely absent for something like the Corwin Amendment.
But that means the legitimacy of the amendment rests not on the rigor of Article 5 itself, but on the political convenience of a later Congress. And that brings us to an even more fundamental question. Who even decides if Article 5 was followed correctly? Is this a legal question for the courts or a procedural one for the political branches?
And I maintain that the question of ratification validity is primarily a non-justiciable political question, which means it's for Congress to decide.
I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the courts can simply sidestep a clear constitutional duty. I mean, let me tell you why. While courts often defer, the judiciary's duty, going all the way back to Marbury v. Madison, is still to say what the law is. If a process violates the spirit and structure of the Constitution, the courts should, at least in theory, be able to say so.
Amendments are the ultimate check the people have on all branches of government, and that includes the Supreme Court itself. So if the judiciary were allowed to rule on the legality of an amendment, especially one that might, overturn a Supreme Court decision, it would violate the old axiom that no one should be a judge in their own case. The amendment process is, by design, the people's ultimate political tool. Therefore, the interpretation has to stay in the political realm with Congress. And the D.C. District Court, in its ruling in Boner versus Anderson, explicitly refused to even consider the validity issue when it was raised in an amicus brief, which really confirms the court's reluctance to step into this area.
Okay, but the judiciary's refusal to rule doesn't magically cure the potential constitutional problem. It just highlights the ambiguity caused by this unique 200-year lapse. And you lean so heavily on that congressional affirmation, but if Congress affirms the amendment, aren't they acting as judges in their own cause, which is the exact problem you're attributing to the courts? Isn't that affirmation just political convenience dressed up as constitutional legitimacy?
I would call it political legitimacy because Article 5 gives Congress the final oversight. They proposed it, and their later affirmation, even if you see it as self-interested, it resolves the political question. They declare that the required state actions were received and counted. They affirm the integrity of the process, which is their constitutional role.
Well, regardless of how we define its validity, I think the real measure of the 27th Amendment's success has to be its practical utility.
I mean, what has this historically strange amendment actually done since 1992?
That is where we see the ideological impact most clearly.
Perhaps, but the actual enforcement has been minimal. The amendment plays a surprisingly minor role because its mandate was already for the most part prescribed by other laws. And on top of that, judicial interpretations have really narrowed its practical reach. Take the D.C. Circuit's finding in Boner v. Anderson. That case was about automatic cost of living adjustments, or COLAs, and the court found that these automatic pay bumps did not violate the amendment. And why? Because the law that set up the formula was enacted before the intervening election.
Right, but that specific interpretation actually reinforces the amendment's mechanism. The court drew a very precise line. Congress, back in 1989, surrendered its direct control over the rate before an election. The increase that happened later was just ministerial, automatic, predictable, not a new legislative law varying compensation passed by a sitting Congress for its own benefit. The boundary was respected.
But that interpretation basically just teaches Congress how to get around the spirit of the amendment. All they have to do is enact an automatic mechanism years in advance. And the result is that members still get pay increases without a clear, conscious vote happening right after an election that could directly rebuke that very action. And we see continued attempts by Congress to manage pay that sort of skirt the amendment's constraints. For example, things like the No Budget, No Pay Act, which tried to temporarily withhold salaries. Those raise big questions. Courts and legal counselors often find that these kinds of disciplinary actions don't count as a law varying the compensation. So its effect on core pay decisions is really negligible. It mostly just operates on the margins.
I think we have to reframe the impact as ideological and preventative, which gets us right back to Madison's original intent. Madison was very aware of the human vice in letting legislators set their own salaries. He wanted to guard against members putting their hands into the public purse for the sake of their own pockets during their current term. The amendment's real power isn't in how often it's litigated, but in the institutional check it imposes. It's a clear, procedural hurdle that forces transparency. Anytime Congress thinks about a raise, the intervening election mechanism ensures a period of public scrutiny and accountability before that raise can take effect. It prevents the kind of stealthy, immediate self-dealing that Madison feared. Its value is the constraint it puts on behavior, even if the dollar amounts are sometimes managed through other legislation.
That's a noble interpretation of its ideological effect. But structural integrity requires more than noble ideals. It requires a sound process. And the process we have here, a 202-year sporadic ratification, it remains a stain on Article V, legitimizing procedural ambiguity all for the sake of political convenience.
Ultimately, the saga of the 27th Amendment shows that the formal text of our founding document can and often must prevail over these inferred structural spirits, especially when the text is silent on a key issue like timing. It met the explicit textual criteria of Article V and demonstrated a robust national consensus in the 1990s, regardless of the centuries that passed between the proposal and the final count.
And I conclude that the amendment remains a constitutional anomaly, a sui generis case whose formal legitimacy came at the cost of clarity within Article V itself. It required ignoring the fundamental principle that constitutional changes have to reflect a timely societal agreement, and in doing so, it created a profound structural weakness that could, in theory, be exploited by resurrecting other, much less desirable proposals.
And the material certainly confirms that the strange longevity of the 27th Amendment forces a critical discussion on whether we are bound strictly by the written word or by the unwritten expectations of consensus held by the founding generation. The meaning of constitutional longevity certainly contains much more to explore.